Today we're going to take a look at a lesson called Forming a Government, and really we're going to look at what the original government of the United States looked like, and then we're going to focus on how it morphed into the form of government that we have today. So our goals are to, number one, describe the strengths and weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, to describe the reasons for and the debates during the Constitutional Convention, and we're going to finish up by talking about some of the compromises reached when we officially get to the Constitution. So those are our three goals for the day. So the first thing I want you to focus on is the idea, if you were one of the founding fathers, which type of government would you want and why? Would you want a unitary government, one with a strong central government? Would you want a confederate government, one that gives most of the power to the states? Or would you want a federal government, one that shares power between a national government and several state governments? Well, my guess is many of you chose federalism, and that's because that's the system we live in today. But if you were a founding father, chances are you wouldn't have chosen that because it wasn't even something that people were thinking of at the time. You probably also wouldn't have chosen a unitary government. We just came from that historical experience. We just came from the fact that we had a unitary government, and that didn't work out so well when we gave all the power to a king. So our founding fathers really wanted to find a better way to do things, and so they thought, well, the best way to do it would be to do the exact opposite of what we had. Instead of having a unitary government with a strong central government, they decided on a confederate government with an extremely weak central government. And the name of that government was the Articles of Confederation. Before we ever wrote a constitution, we had a document. Our first founding document was known as the Articles of Confederation. And as the name suggests, it was a confederate government. It was a list of ideals set up to create the Confederation. So, the Articles of Confederation, actually an extremely weak form of government. In fact, the exact words that were used in the Articles of Confederation themselves was that this government would be a firm league of friendship. A firm league of friendship? What kind of government is that? A firm league of friendship? Really? That's how you describe your new government? And yeah, that's how you describe it. Because the whole purpose of the new government was to kind of take things down a notch. People were very mistrusting of the government. They didn't believe in the government, and so they wanted to give the government as little power as possible. And so they created a government that had a very weak central government. They gave all the powers to the states, and the only power that the national government had was what was absolutely necessary. Things like maybe forming an army for self-defense, or that's about it. This was really a government that focused on the states. It focused on the sovereignty, on the power of the states to rule over themselves. And so the central government, incredibly weak. So if we look at what the Articles of Confederation actually did, what the government looked like, it had a legislative branch. It had a part of the government that was going to make the laws. That legislative branch was selected by the states, not too different from what we have today. But then it didn't have an executive branch. Yes, there was no president. There was no chief executive. The leader of the Confederation was essentially chosen by the legislature and didn't really have any power. So without an executive branch, we've got nobody to enforce the laws that have been made by the legislative branch. And, well, yeah, there was also no judicial branch. So if you had a dispute about a law, if you didn't agree with the law, there was no branch of government to take it to look at it, to review it. So some of the powers that the national government did have, some of the things that the national government could do under the Articles of Confederation, they could declare war. The number one purpose of forming the Confederation in the first place was for defense, so war was a big one. They never did, but it's important that they could. They could negotiate with other countries. That's something pretty standard that countries do. And a postal system. Post office is important back in the 1700s because back in the 1700s, you didn't have text messages, you didn't have emails. The way that you could communicate and have commerce is through a postal system. So that was important in order to be able to communicate. Other than that, there weren't a ton of powers that the national government could do. There were a lot of weaknesses that we can point out. Number one, no matter how big the state is, every state got one vote. So you could be the biggest state in the Union, Virginia, and you could be the tiniest state in the Union, probably like Connecticut or something like that. And no matter how big or how small your population, you have the same number of votes. And so, of course, the larger states weren't really too happy with that. There was no power for the national government, for the Confederate government, to charge taxes. Now, states could charge taxes if they wanted, but the only way for the national government to get money was to go to the states and basically ask for it. And if a state wanted to give them money, they could, they would. Sometimes they did, but there was no power by the national government to charge taxes, and so without money, it's pretty hard to fund a government. There was no power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce, so you could trade with other countries or with other states, but the national government had no power to regulate that. So in essence, each individual state could come up with a separate agreement with a foreign country, and that made things complicated. States would end up competing against each other. Of course, we already mentioned there's no executive branch and there is no judicial branch. That's a major problem. And then if you wanted to amend the system, if you wanted to change the system, you had to get all 13 states to agree. Now, think about getting 4 members of your family to agree on where to go to dinner, and then try to think about if you needed to get 13 states with very different interests to agree on changing the Articles of Confederation. This was so difficult that they were never actually able to amend the Articles of Confederation. And in fact, even to get a simple law passed, you had to have 9 out of the 13 states agree. And even this was so challenging, it only happened once with the entire existence of the Articles of Confederation, and that was with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This was the only time that there was ever a law passed by the Articles of Confederation. It's the only thing they ever got done. And what the Northwest Ordinance did is it came up with a method to admit new states into the Union, including Michigan. That's how we got into the Union under the Northwest Ordinance. So the Northwest Ordinance, all it really did is say, if we're going to add new states, new territories, this is going to be the way we do it. And so it allowed the Northwest Territories, which included Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and the worst state ever, into the Union. So again, to review, your book had a list of weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. There weren't a whole lot of strengths to the Articles of Confederation, and so it became pretty apparent pretty quickly that this form of government wasn't going to work and that we needed to try something new, we needed to try something. It became obvious, it became apparent in 1786 that the system wasn't working. That brings us to Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion, Daniel Shay was a farmer from Massachusetts, and really you don't need to know much about Shays Rebellion, but what happened is after the Revolutionary War, many of the farmers, by the time we got to the early 1780s, many of the farmers couldn't afford to pay their debts. And back then, if you didn't pay your debt, you didn't go bankrupt, you went to jail. And a lot of this was caused by the high taxes that were charged in order to pay for the war. So farmers are paying high taxes, they can't pay for their debts, they're going to jail. And Daniel Shay led a group of other farmers in a rebellion against the government. Over 1,200 farmers would rebel against the government because the government just wasn't able to respond to the needs of the farmers. Now, maybe fortunately or unfortunately for Shay, depending on how you look at it, Shay's rebellion was not a success. The rebellion was crushed by the national government. Shay and his people were put in jail. Things didn't really work out that way. Didn't work out the way they had intended it to. But needless to say, Shay's rebellion did prove a point. It proved that the national government was not working, that the national government wasn't successful, and that there was a need for change. The major success of Shays Rebellion is, again, proving that we need a new form of government. And that's exactly when our founding fathers are going to step in, when they're going to come up with the Constitutional Convention. Now, I think it's important to note that when our founding fathers sat together at the Constitutional Convention, they initially did not call it a Constitutional Convention. They met on a steamy day in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. You can see my trip to Philadelphia was not a steamy hot day. It was in the middle of the winter. But when the framers of the Constitution met on May 25th, 1787, they met in what was known as Independence Hall. And the framers, for what it's worth, were some of the most well-educated people in society at the time. Sometimes we think that they may have been commoners. They were not. These were some of the richest, wealthiest, most educated people. And many of these people were scholars of the Enlightenment. They had studied the Enlightenment. They had studied what was going on in England at the time, and they wanted to bring these ideas to the United States. They wanted to bring, well, what would eventually become the United States. They wanted to implement some of the ideas that they were learning about, some of the ideas that they were thinking about. They wanted to implement them into their newly formed government. And so that's exactly what they did. Now, again, I noted that it was pretty cold when I went to Philadelphia, but if you were to go to Independence Hall on May 25th, 1787, the day the Constitutional Convention started, it was a pretty hot and steamy day. And this is important because the Founding Fathers locked themselves inside Independence Hall. They didn't want anybody to hear about their disagreements. They didn't want anybody to hear what they were fighting about. They didn't want to look like they were ununified. So their whole goal, their whole solution was to meet in secret. And what that meant is not only meeting in this building, but closing off all the windows, closing all the shades, locking the windows. They wanted everything to be 100% secret. So while I'm not going to test you on whether or not it was a hot or cold day, understand that this was a huge sacrifice. Many students don't like to sit in class when the temperature is about 75 degrees in the classroom. So think about what they were enduring day after day, week after week on this extremely warm summer in Philadelphia. My favorite president is probably most famous, not actually for being the fourth president of the United States, but for being the father of the Constitution. That is James Madison. James Madison came to the game, he came to the party ready to go. A lot of times when people have great ideas, they like to complain, but they don't really have a plan or a solution. James Madison was different. When he came to the Constitutional Convention, unlike everybody else who showed up and said, yeah, we kind of think the Articles of Confederation, they're not a really good form of government, James Madison, he was taking notes on what everybody was saying, what everybody was complaining about, and he came prepared. Not only did he take notes, but he said, okay, well, since none of you have a plan, here's my plan. These are the things that I want. And he ends up playing a most instrumental role in shaping the Constitution. We call him the father of the Constitution because he's the one who had the plan. And when you have a plan, you're most likely to get what you want. Doesn't mean you're going to get everything you want, but if you are the one on top of things, you get to shape the course of things, especially the course of our government. So James Madison was a strong believer in a strong national government. He said, look, Articles of Confederation, it's too weak. The government has no real influence, no real way of getting things done. We need to have a strong central government. Now, he didn't want to make it so strong that it was a unitary government again. He realized that there were faults with the old government, but still he believed in a strong national government. He said that if the Union is to succeed, we have to have a government that's got the power to do stuff, like make laws, enforce them, and then interpret them. His whole goal was to avoid the idea of another tyrant, to avoid another king from coming to power. And so he wanted to write into the system of government a system of checks and balances, a way for the government to make sure that no one branch of the government got too powerful. And he did this by separating the powers, by having a separate person write the laws, make the laws, a separate branch enforce the laws, and a separate branch interpret the laws. Now, if we look at one of the major issues that's going to happen, we're going to have to reform the way our legislative branch is formed, the way the representatives are formed. And so I want you to consider, how should we determine the number of representatives in Congress and the legislative branch? Should we, A, base it on population? If you're a larger state, you get more votes. Or should it be votes based on equal votes per state? Well, this was going to be one of the major issues at the time because there was a significant difference between the largest and the small states in the Union. The largest state in the Union, Virginia, had almost 1 million people in it. Delaware had about 50,000. So with such discrepancies between the largest and the smallest, there was going to be a battle over who had representation. There was going to be a battle over how much representation was given to each colony. Of course, larger states would want it to be based on population, while the smaller states would say, hey, we're all in this together. We all fought the revolution together. We all fought for independence together. We should stick with this together. So when we look at the almost 4 million people in America, they were greatly divided on where representation should exist within Congress. So the plan proposed by Virginia, the most famous plan, the Virginia plan, was written by James Madison. James Madison came up with this idea that, well, the larger states should get more votes. He believed that the government should have a strong central government and that the legislative branch should be bicameral, bi meaning two. So there should be two different branches of the legislative branch, and that should be based on population. He said, look, if we've got more people, we should have more influence on the way the government works. On the other side, we've got William Paterson, who led the great state of New Jersey. New Jersey, while not the smallest, was still a relatively small state at the time. And Paterson says, look, we're all in this together. We helped fight the revolution together. We risked our lives together. And so we need to have a government that not only focuses on the big states, but the little states as well. He did believe in a powerful central government, maybe not as powerful as Madison did, but he thought that there should be some power in the central government. He believed in a legislative branch that was unicameral, only one branch of the Congress, and he believed in equal representation between all the states. He said, look, we're all in this together. Every state should get an equal number of votes. Which brings us to the Great Compromise, or sometimes what is called the Connecticut Plan. It was written by a guy named Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman of Connecticut comes up with the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Plan as it's sometimes called, takes the best of both systems. Takes a bicameral system, which the Virginia Plan was calling for, and it said that there should be a House of Representatives based on population. Note that that's also part of the Virginia Plan. But it also said that there should be a Senate based on equality. The second branch of government should be based on the idea of equal representation. The idea that both states, all states, should get an equal number of representatives. And this was the way to make everybody happy. The bigger states got a little more influence in the House of Representatives. Well, the smaller states still showed that they were an important part of the Union when it came to the Senate. And this is the plan that will get adopted today. If we look at Article 1 of the Constitution, it says that we have a bicameral Congress based on a House based on population and a Senate based on equal representation. Everybody had to give a little to get a little. Next major question. Were our framers, were the founding fathers, were the people who wrote our Constitution, were they racist? A is yes, B is no. If you said they're racist, you're probably thinking it from the point of view that they allowed slaves. And one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest deals during the Constitutional Convention is what's going to happen with slavery. We often think that slavery is an issue that comes about in the 1860s with the Civil War. It's not. It's an issue that begins in the late 1700s. When our country is first being formed, when we're first writing the Constitution, we're trying to debate, should slavery be legal? And there's a big push in America to outlaw slavery. However, if you do this, you are going to upset the southern states. You are going to upset those states from the South. And so, flat out, they come up with what is known as the Slave Compromise. They say that for the first 20 years that the United States is in existence, slavery will be legal. There will be no questions. We're not even going to take a vote on the issue for at least 20 years. Then if the country is still around in 20 years, and if this is still an issue worth fighting over, maybe then we can start to discuss it, but slavery will be legal for the first 20 years. Does that make our founding fathers racist? By today's standards, absolutely. But they were doing what they had to do. They were doing something that many members of Congress can't do today, and that is compromise. They understood that the Union might not exist, might not survive if they tried to outlaw slavery. And so as terrible as slavery is as much as this is one of the worst mistakes that our country would ever make, they were just doing what they felt they needed to do to keep the country going at the time. Next question. Do you think the states in the North wanted to count slaves for population purposes? Why or why not? A is yes, B is no. if you said yes, you were probably thinking of the fact that the North was more likely to look at slaves as being a bad thing, and that they should count, that the slaves in the North should count as people. You'd be wrong. The North, as much as they wanted to abolish slavery, they also recognized that if you count slaves as part of population, that would give the southern states a much larger population than the northern states. And so it was actually the northern states that were saying, look, slaves shouldn't count towards your population. People in the South, of course, are saying, well, yeah, we don't really think slaves have rights, but they should be counted for population. They live there. And this was another one of the major debates that would take place. And the ultimate compromise, the ultimate way we do this, is probably one of the worst decisions in American history, one of the most dehumanizing decisions in American history, the Three-Fifths Compromise. But it was a compromise. It was a way to get around it. It was a way to really just keep our country together. And so what the Three-Fifths Compromise says is that for every 5 slaves you have, 3 of them will count as a person for purposes of representation. So for every 5 slaves you have, 3 of them count towards population. Because if we look at the population of the North was 98% free, 2% slave. If we look at the population of the South, it was about 65% free, about 35% slave. And so if we look at the free population in the South, 38%, North, 62%. The North is going to have more people anyways if we just look at free people. And so the slave trade compromise, if we use the Three-Fifths Compromise, the North will still have a little bit more population, but it will be much more even. Instead of 38-62, we've got 48 to 52%. And so we eventually go with, even though the North doesn't want slaves to be counted, they eventually agree to the Three-Fifths Compromise. So, to review, we've got the Great Compromise, that Connecticut Compromise, which said we'll have a bicameral legislature comprised of a House based on population and a Senate based on equal representation. The Three-Fifths Compromise saying that for every 5 slaves you have, 3 of them count as a person for population. And the Slave Trade Compromise saying that we're not even going to deal with slavery for 20 years. Why are all these 3 important? Because they show compromise. They show that each side is willing to give in. Each side is willing to give a little. You can't be 100% stubborn and get everything you want. If everybody gets everything they want, we would never have a government. So a lesson to be learned from our founding fathers, it's important to learn to compromise. It's important to learn to work together, and maybe you get some of what you want, maybe you get some of what you don't want, but at least you get the government going. Which will bring us to our next lesson for another day, the actual Constitution itself, what the Constitution looks like, and how it functions. For now, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you soon.